Hello everyone, I'm Matthew. This is my first video on the channel. It's the first video at all on the channel, and it's going to be rough, sort of intentionally. As you can see behind me, the office is a bit of a mess. Audio is going to be hit or miss because I'm not really sure all the settings and how it's going to end up in editing, which is mostly going to be done by AI. Boy, do I hate video editing. It's tedious and never turns out as well as I'd like it to. But yeah. Also video. I'm using my webcam from 2013 that's still for some reason a thing that you can buy. It's a Logitech, 9200 or 920C? So I don't remember. It's the generic Logitech 1080p webcam. I've had it forever. So this first video, we're going for a raw and authentic sort of a feel. We'll see how well that does. And it's sort of on topic, kind of telling myself that. So we'll see. I'm going to be talking about sin, which is certainly a controversial topic, perhaps the most controversial subject in all of Christianity, because human moral fallibility sucks and no one wants to talk about it. I'm going to do my best to speak to it in a way that's clear and makes sense. Historically, near historically anyway, the church has talked about it pretty bluntly. The whole fire and brimstone teaching style from the last few centuries. It centers on a delivery where the listener is accused of being a sinner and going to hell, often especially for specific sins that are particularly egregious in a given age or to a given denomination. Modern pastors tend to be more tactful, raw and authentic. My arm was, or the mic arm was in the way of my arm. So they tend to stray away from the topic because it hurts feelings and comes across as generally offensive, which we don't like offending people anymore, which, you know, is kind of good in some ways and not so good in others. Put both of these groups in a room, and one will say the other is too blunt and will drive people away, and the other that the first is too soft and deprives people of hearing the truth. For my part, and the reason I'm making this video as it happens, I find both parties seem to fall short of properly explaining the concept, which is not good. When correctly explained, at least in my mind, the idea of sin becomes easier to understand. Perhaps this is even the reason the whole fire and brimstone style was so effective in its day. It had a context that we lack now, and it just comes off as abrasive. Certainly, the reality of sin was a reality to the people in the first century and near centuries after that, because it came with a context of understanding the Old Testament, and to a degree, at least in the Americas, well, the Western world really has a Judeo-Christian background, so there was a lot of general understood knowledge of Old Testament concepts, history, modes of thought that we sort of lack nowadays. So the idea of being a sinner doesn't really jive well with how people want to look at themselves. So in this way, with a context that we're sort of lacking nowadays, the idea of sin becomes a lot less offensive. In fact, it basically comes across as common sense, or at least sensible. Part 1. Are you a good person? To start, do you think you are a good person? Seriously, are you a good person? If your hackles are up and you're feeling defensive, this shows why this topic is so controversial. Both the fire and brimstone teacher and the modern evangelist often use this question to bluntly reason a person into a hard face-to-face confrontation with their own morality. In both cases, they will assert that no, you are not good. Then either go on to rain down the fire and brimstone, or squirm their way through an uncomfortable discussion on sin while desperately trying not to hurt your feelings and stay likable. I'm not going to do that. It's not because I have some rhetorical tact. It's because I think the question is stupid. Why? Well, the word for good in English doesn't mean the same thing that good means in the Bible, as the Bible's good essentially means perfection, oftentimes. And it's that oftentimes that's the problem here. It creates some unintended consequences when you try and force good to mean perfection all the time. Preachers will often explain the difference between, let's say, English good and Bible good being essentially the difference between general goodness as a concept and good as perfection. And they'll use that discussion itself to reframe that question. You think you are good, but actually the Bible says good is perfect and yada yada yada. But that line of question, that line of reason itself betrays a flawed premise, in fact. And we'll get to that. Because here's the thing. You are good. That's part of the reason why this whole sin topic is so complicated and offensive and irritating. And the reason I call the question stupid is it immediately forces the listener into a box where they are ignorant, immoral, and wretched, not even understanding the basic premise of a question because you don't understand the framing of the argument. Actually, the Bible says, well, then actually, why didn't you just ask that question in the first place? Well, the Bible, specifically in the context where it discusses sinners being sinners, is a written record of oral tradition delivered in a culture that fully understood the context and logic of what I'm about to explain. We talked about that just a little bit, but we lack that context. The Bible can say whatever truth it needs to, but approaching the biblical truth in an actually the Bible says way is fundamentally obnoxious, agitating, and unproductive. That's why the Bible itself doesn't do it that way, nor did the church historically. And I don't mean like near historically fire and brimstone. I mean like centuries 1, 2, 3, 4, like Roman Empire still existed, that sort of historically. Granted, sometimes truths need to be hard truths in order to be effective, but this is, in fact, a hard falsehood. The people asking the "Are you a good person?" question often don't properly understand the error of the question they're asking. Why? Because the question isn't that simple. You can't reframe the translation of the biblical concept of good into English good and move that into perfection and then into a theological debate. Why not? Well, because the translation itself is problematic. Gosh, I hate that word, problematic. It's just like good. It means more than you think it does, and now it's been reduced to something. Problematic is a buzzword. It's kind of why I used it, actually. I still hate it, though. It's not totally wrong. Good, I mean. But it's incomplete. Good does mean perfection, but it doesn't always mean perfection, and that matters. Amusingly, with the assumption that good means perfection, the logic of the question, "Are you a good person?" becomes a flawed question, an imperfect question, therefore not good, and therefore evil. A bit ironic. The problem here is there's more to English good than just the archaic notion of moral perfection, although that does exist and we'll get to it. To state it clearly, There is more than one biblical concept that translates into good. And because this question tries to make good only perfection, this ends up making the entire notion reductive, an incorrectness people natively realize. That's why I hate this "are you good? Are you a good person?" question. So let's talk about why you are, in fact, good. In Genesis, the first book of the Bible, where the fall of man occurred, this fall transpired because humanity ate from a tree, right? Pretty general biblical knowledge, like there's a guy named Jesus, there's a guy named Moses. Oversimplified media portrays this as an evil fruit, often an apple, but the tree has much more significance. The tree is called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Names are important in the Bible. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil gets its name for the ability this fruit conveys. Same as the tree of life. The tree of life is pretty obvious. You get life. Eternal life, even. But what about the tree of the knowledge of good and evil? This is also a little deceptive due to translation. Just like how good is deceptive due to translation. But knowledge in this case is more than just awareness. Essentially, knowledge is nature. Instinct level knowledge, your instincts. The fruit conveys the capacity to judge good and evil. Instinctually. It conveys moral agency. Also, the tree itself is not evil. It was just forbidden. The Bible says that everything in the garden was good. And the tree was in the garden. Ergo, the tree was a good tree. Because of this, because humanity has the traits conveyed by the tree, you are, in fact, good. After a fashion. Ignoring this, ignoring the good, is why the "are you a good person" question, haha, no, you actually are imperfect, therefore not good, question, is so confusing, frustrating, and unproductive. God said not to eat of the fruit of the tree that conveys moral agency, and in doing so, mankind simultaneously sinned by being disobedient and learned how to judge good and evil. This simultaneous act of sin and revelation being the revealed to us what good and evil is and how we now natively judge it, this led to what's called sin nature. Not just moral agency, but moral agency that is misaligned. This is to say, the tree was not the tree of sin nature. It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We have the knowledge of good, nature of good. So this is why I consider the "are you a good person" question stupid. You are a morally good person. You're not a morally perfect person, but you are a morally good person, at least as far as the English good is concerned. Therefore, the "are you a good person" question not only unnecessarily puts the asker in an obnoxious position, but also makes God look petty without a clarifying context. Clarifying context that no one wants to sit through because the introduction to the theology was so tactless. Ergo, stupid question. Part 2. Reframing the idea. Now, I'm not throwing my fellow Christians under the bus for clout. In fact, when you think about it, it takes a lot of courage in this day and age to confront people on a difficult topic. Unless, of course, that comes out of hubris, which is a whole different can of worms. But most of them do what they do because of an earnest and compassionate concern for you. I'm sure you can think of some exceptions, particularly in fictional media, but for the most part they mean well, as do you, which is the point. It just sucks that the question is so dumb. Contrary to popular thought, the Bible values knowledge and wisdom. The book of Proverbs goes on and on about how valuable wisdom is. It's more valuable than gold and silver. Knowledge is something that you're supposed to accumulate. It is important. It is helpful. It is useful. Oftentimes, however, the concern for others leads to a blind zeal that results in errors. This in part, is why the Bible says to speak the truth in love. Because you are going to trip yourself up at points, even if you don't mean to do so. But again, they mean well, and so do you. This is the core of the idea, and we'll get to that in a bit, but let's go back to the "are you a good person" question, and are you a perfect person question. To address the idea of perfection, let's forget about God for a bit. I know, that's a weird ask for a theological discussion, but bear with me. We've established that we're morally good people due to the effects of the forbidden fruit. But what does that actually mean? Well, sin nature is a modifier. With just the fruit, it's essentially a nature of good and evil. Perfect. You'd be able to see good and evil in perfect clarity. Sin nature alters the capacity to judge good and evil, alters the moral nature. Think about what you know about yourself. You can judge good and evil. You have moral opinions. More than that, you value good and reject evil, right? It's not a rhetorical question. It's also not a call to look at others. You specifically, can judge good and evil, valuing good and rejecting evil. Correct? Yes. This is something we all have, something we all claim. But now, what about other people? They do the same, right? If we do it, if it is human, humans do it, others do it. That being said, some people appear to be evil. Sometimes only a little bit evil, sometimes more obviously evil, and sometimes so evil that we have a tough time recognizing them as human. Therein lies the rub. We all, individually, know that we are good, that we can judge good and evil, favoring good and rejecting evil, but also all are seemingly capable of seeing that others make mistakes. Moral mistakes. We often even recognize we make mistakes of our own, but ultimately our good outweighs our evil, right? Sort of the fingers crossed assumption that we all like to have. Most Christians say no here, but theology paints a more complicated picture. And I know there's definitely some Christians wondering where I'm going with this. Does good outweigh evil? Yes and no. Here's the thing. Good outweighs evil in terms of what we value. It comes with the fundamental premise of the question. We favor good and reject evil. This is another point where the topic gets prickly and unnecessarily reductive. To say we are more evil than good. But does good outweigh evil? Perhaps. In raw figures. In a pure bean counter kind of a way. But is the question even valid? No. The relative weights, the scale of good strictly being more than evil, doesn't matter. This is where the standard of perfection comes in. Even the slightest presence of evil is enough to corrupt. It sounds harsh, understandably, but I'm not gonna just dive into a theological explanation. We forgot God exists for the time being, remember? To deconstruct it, let's consider a thought experiment. You think you're good, right? I agree for the most part. In fact, we are likely to agree on a lot of things about good and evil. For example, murder is wrong. Likewise, sexual assault is wrong, abusing children is wrong, heck, abusing anyone is wrong, abusing to misuse. On the opposite side of the spectrum, kindness is good. Patience is good, honesty is good, love is pretty good. All this is to say, people tend to have a lot in common, one to another. It's even a common notion about getting along, that getting to know people leads one to realize how much we have in common. Nevertheless, there will always be differences, usually small. People might litter, people might tell offensive jokes, others might be mean to animals, not even physically abusive, just more vocally harsh than you might think is appropriate when talking to a dog. or a puppy, especially a puppy. A lot of people don't like when you're mean to puppies. And then some people are still mean to puppies. It gives us a clue as to what's going on, though. Perspective. Let's go to the opposite extreme. Talk about evil, where commonality is not a given. To do this, let's consider a man. Consider a man that is progressive in terms of animal welfare, isn't mean to puppies. He's progressive in terms of health and economic stability. Historically, this guy passed some of the strictest animal protection laws in the world at the time, restricting something called vivisection, the experimental surgery on living animals while they weren't sedated, and added protections for animals during transport and slaughter. Likewise, he ran some of the earliest large-scale anti-smoking public health campaigns, funding research into links between smoking and lung cancer, while restricting smoking in public places. Finally, he funded massive public works projects, industrial expansion that reduced unemployment, and promised and pursued economic stabilization that restored national pride and dignity. Wait, this was supposed to be the opposite, right? An evil guy? Someone with whom we all collectively disagree? Well, he was also a painter, if that tells you who I'm talking about. Yeah, I'm talking about Hitler. Am I saying Hitler was a good person? I don't know, am I? Have I really trapped myself logically? Trapped myself in a script I wrote, proofed a number of times, failed to record a more number of times, and I'm still recording, editing, and publishing? No, of course not. I was careful. Hitler, like all of us, was a good person in that he valued good and rejected evil. But, and this is obviously critical, human capacity to judge good and evil is imperfect. Sometimes it's very imperfect. Occasionally, it's even obviously imperfect on a large scale, such as Hitler. The Bible even talks about this. There was lawlessness in the land, where evil people the Bible called worthless people, committed vile acts like mass murder, gang rape, and torture. But, evil as they obviously were, the Bible described these people in a very interesting way. It described them as doing what was good in their own eyes. Not as evil, though they were, because even evil people still value what they think is good. This is how a man, Hitler, could advocate for animal rights while denying entire people groups their human rights. It's how he could fight against people poisoning themselves with toxic gases from cigarettes and signing off on gassing Jews, Romani, homosexuals, the disabled, and all manner of other political dissidents. This is how he could seek to rebuild his own country, albeit at the expense of the rest of the planet. Evil as Hitler was, he was still the hero of his own story, a man who did what he thought was good. A man who was good in the same way that we value good, just from a different perspective. A very, very screwed up perspective. Again, am I saying Hitler was good? Perfection good? No. He thought he was good. We don't have to agree with him. That said, we're doing ourselves a disservice in demonizing Hitler. Not because the man wasn't evil, but because the man still thought he was doing good. Sure, Hitler was evil, I don't contest that. I don't want to even appear to contest that for obvious internet reasons. Despite having some traits and opinions that were objectively good by today's standards, beliefs that align against things we would now consider horrific crimes even, the man was evil. Yet to demonize this, to say Hitler was pure evil, is to rob the cautionary tale of its function. It takes examples like Hitler to show that people are, in fact, evil. Not that Hitler was evil, though he was, but that he was a person, and people are evil. Yeah, that stings. I know. It's an uncomfortable truth. But think about it. Was newborn Adolf evil? Not simply imperfect evil, but I mean mustache-twirling Third Reich evil? No, he was a baby. What about 1-year-old Hitler? 2-year-old Hitler? When do you think the switch flipped? When do you think he became an uber evil? Or do you think maybe it was more a product of many, many small switches flipping? Many discrete seeming choices through indulgence, compromise, and the imperfect good that turns the ordinary, very natively human evil into recognizably grand evil. Be careful. The answer of him being rotten from the start makes the question easy and comfortable. It detaches us from a monster, but it leaves humanity, you and me, robbed of our agency and capacity to choose good over evil. It bows to fate and leaves us as puppets. It also logically would mean that evil isn't a person's fault, that Hitler wasn't ultimately responsible for Hitler's evil because he was helpless to do anything else. Perhaps he even deserves mercy because he was born with the wrong hand of cards. Sounds a bit absurd. If you follow the rabbit trail of logic, it compromises a lot for a comfortable answer. The far more uncomfortable answer is that our choices matter. Evil people choose to be evil, but even that doesn't need to mean they choose evil because they like evil itself. Not necessarily, not always. In fact, it means something darker, something harder to recognize, harder to accept, yet ultimately more sensible when it's made clear. It means that people choose evil because they think they are choosing good. This is the deepest essence of evil. Thinking wrong is right. And it's why evil is so deceptive. It appeals to our better nature. And to further the discomfort, if you can't trust your ability to recognize good, true good, perfect good, then how can you know you are not evil? Yeah. The question sucks. It really makes you realize what you are. It's an existential moral terror. This is the heart of the problem with the "do you think you are a good person?" question. But it's rarely ever properly articulated. Again, this is why I think it's a stupid question. Not because the person asking it is stupid necessarily, but because the question is fundamentally incomplete. You can be good and not be good. Good, but not perfect. Good, even to the point where you feel good enough because you fundamentally value good, but not good enough to judge good perfectly. Your perspective is off. All of humanity's perspective is off. You can even see it clearly by the fact that we all have different perspectives on good and evil. We're all flawed. Part 3. Sin nature. If I were to ask, are you a sinner? Most people would balk at the question. Most of this comes from the fact that most people don't know what sin is. Even Christians often fail to keep from oversimplifying it. Most just don't want to be thwopped upside the head with a Bible. We know sin is bad, at least. So in the absence of a deeper understanding, the question is reduced to a "are you a bad person?" question. The answer then is usually no. Who wants to buy into the idea of being a bad person? Christians falsely believe or blindly assume that the hesitation simply comes from an unenlightened mind. This can be true. The Bible clearly attributes the desire for change coming from the Holy Spirit as an opening of the eyes, but this is certainly hampered by a confusion of terms. Just because one needs to be convicted of a desire to change does not mean there's not a responsibility of the evangelist to know what they're talking about. So let's discuss sin. You know why you're a form of good in the biblical sense. According to the Bible, you have been given a capacity to judge good and evil, and you favor good while hating evil. Yet, at the same time, you know that no one's perfect. We easily admit this collectively. But once the no one in no one is perfect includes ourselves, it starts to get a little bit prickly. We even have an array of excuses and dismissals, like the classic "no one is perfect," the postmodern "everyone has their own truth," and an array of tribalistic beliefs that sets our group's morality over that of the outsiders. But what does that tell you? What does it mean for those two concepts to exist simultaneously? Goodness and imperfection. Is it a paradox? No. We already covered that. One can observe and value good while simultaneously being blinded by their own imperfection, our own flaws, our own evils. See, prickly, but logical. But that said, it's something we can all share, something we can admit, at least collectively, for now, so that it doesn't hurt as much. If not, why is there war? Why are there racists, sexists, people who commit evil? This isn't just a psycho-emotional construct. It allows evil to exist, to explain why evil exists, but also allows us to keep our good. That being said, it also means we ourselves bear responsibility for evil. Some evil. Our evil. Do we have our own little evils? Of course. Are they bad? Well, we'll see. Consider it this way. You may agree with others in terms of what is good and evil, but the agreement is never perfect. Dig deep enough and you'll find some non-trivial disagreement. You'll see something in them that you know is wrong, undeniably wrong, yet you can't quite articulate why in a way that satisfies them, even if the logic is sound. Despite how undeniable it is to you, the other person can't quite see what you mean, can't feel the same way as you do. On occasion, they'll see what you mean, that person will change, but more often than not, there'll be a mitigating circumstance that allows them to get away with or justify the perceived evil, sometimes even appealing to something that you do in hypocrisy that somehow alleviates them of their guilt, so they don't have to change. But you still know the truth and can't shake the conviction, right? On the other side of the coin, another might be convicted that you believe something incorrectly, that you cannot quite see something from the right perspective and need to be enlightened. Sometimes this hits home and it drives you to change, occasionally even drawing out some uncomfortable resistance that makes you feel good when you overcome it, or embarrassed when you look back. Yet there's also other times where it's refuted with some excuse that justifies the perspective or behavior, something that, despite the conviction, makes it okay. Not good per se, but good enough. This is sin. Not in a biblical sense, not yet, but the basic premise. Moral disagreement. Sin, at least as it concerns person-to-person consideration, perceived sin, horizontal sin, if I can coin a term, can be thought of, if temporarily, as just the differences of moral opinions. From your perspective, the errors in moral judgment are sin against your morality, whereas from the other person's perspective, your errors are sins against theirs. It's quite simple and much easier to accept, and harder to deny in that context. We disagree on moral things, right? But is sin just a difference in opinions? Sort of. It becomes a bit more complicated when God is involved again. But let's hold off on that for a moment. Let me ask you this. If sin is just differences of moral opinions and all people have their own opinions that are somehow equal, everyone has their own truth, so to speak, then is murder wrong? What about sexual assault? What about racism, sexism? Of course, the first instinct is to wrap the issue up in a notion that evil begins when others harm each other, but where does that line of harm even begin? Physically? Emotionally? Psychologically? Murder and sexual assault, sure, but does a racist even technically harm you? Even if you know it's wrong to be racist? Sure, it can lead to harm, but is silent racism wrong if it's silent? Without getting into a ping-pong match of trying to figure out how the standards are set, perhaps it would be better to address a painful, if self-evident, truth. If we all value goodness, and we all are imperfect, and we all disagree, doesn't that imply that we're all just mostly good? That we're all morally imperfect? all incapable of judging moral things perfectly? And given this, is it perhaps worth considering that there might not be a truth for each person, but just a perspective instead? That we all have something to sacrifice, something to change in order to find true perfection? That we can all be good after a fashion, but all have our blind spots? That collectively, if those blind spots were removed, that would be perfection? Furthermore, if we all have perspectives and we're all imperfect and we all value good, and evil often manifests as the pursuit of an evil we falsely believe is good, doesn't that mean we're all evil? Not mustache twirling, not horrific and absolute, just misaligned, just fundamentally incapable of being perfect in our own judgment because we lack a perfect perspective? Are you a good person? Yes. Yes, you are. Are you a perfectly good person? No. No, you're not. Does the difference matter? That's the real question. And yes. Yes, it does. How do we know? How do we know moral perfection actually matters? Because it hurts to admit we are falling short. The pain reveals the truth. Part 4. Does moral perfection matter? This is where it gets uncomfortable again. If you dig down, deep down, when asked if you are a morally perfect person, the heart gets defensive. Once more, this isn't an opportunity to compare yourself with others. It's not an attack either, even if it is a challenge. It is, however, why it's stupid to jump into the "are you a good person" question as an evangelist, why I have so painstakingly built a context for you. So, let me see if I can make it a little bit more comfortable. We live in a world where everyone puts their best foot forward, where everyone wears a mask, not the COVID kind, the false self kind of mask. Social media is an all-consuming void of comparison, status, and one-upsmanship fueled by the platforms and brands of the most narcissistic and successful people, by arenas where corporations encourage tribalism because tribes fight, and fighting is activity, and activity creates discourse, and discourse offers more venues for paying advertisements. Money fuels it all at our mutual expense, even if we're being nickel and dimed out of it subtly via our sanity. We live in a world of physical scarcity, but also one of social scarcity, just as we learn to live on our own, to provide for ourselves. In a world where things are not provided for us, we grew out of a childish existence where love and acceptance were once given to us, at least most of us, or perhaps just many of us, with little expectation. We now fend for ourselves. It's a world where what's offered is never enough. This is at two ends. First, at the end of physical, social, and psychological starvation, which drives us to meet the bare minimums to survive. But second, we strive to satisfy an ever-growing mental hamster wheel of emotional self-satisfaction amidst a strangling, suffocating, overwhelming miasma of abundance. Yet in either case, it does not satisfy. There is a void in each and every one of us, and even if we manage to fill it for a time, feel as though we fill it for a time, it always drains away. When you look into the darkness, it looks back. So we ignore it. It scares us because the darkness is within us. It's outside too, sure, but it's there, deep down, beneath the pile of things under which we attempt to drown it, always consuming its way back to us face to face, always patiently finding its way back. You're not good enough. You're imperfect. You're evil. You see that face of yourself that you show no one, and you know it's lacking. It's why the question is so hard to process. Are you a morally perfect person? One can blame the world for not having enough to survive, citing circumstance. One can blame others for lack of social support, accusing peers. But when one looks deep into oneself and finds lacking, one has only oneself to blame. And that sucks. This is why the question is so stupid. It drags a person, drags you, into the most painful, vulnerable, and fragile state of reflection. All on a gotcha premise. Are you a good person? Seems innocuous in its simple wording, but what is really being asked by the "are you a good person" question? Essentially, are you willing to face the very troubling reality of your own moral shortcomings in a world where you've been conditioned to expect the strong to eat the weak? Yeah, that's what I want to talk about on a street corner with a stranger. Part 5. Were we ever perfect? What if I told you we were never perfect? Even before the fall, even according to the Bible. The account of Genesis is well known in a general sense, but the details are important, just like the name of that tree. Let me summarize it first. God created a good creation. Adam and Eve were morally perfect, morally ignorant, but morally perfect, prior to eating the fruit. God says that they can eat of anything in the garden, except for this one tree. Satan tempts them. They eat the forbidden fruit and fall. Pretty simple, right? Well, there's one important detail that's often left out. Well, there's a lot of important details, but this one's very important to the topic. After God said not to eat of the tree and Satan tempted Eve, Eve replied that God said not to eat it, or even touch it. In the logic of the Bible, that would have been a sin, misrepresenting God, but it wasn't. How do we know that? Well, because she didn't fall right then, right there. But why? Why did she say this, though? It's not a sin, she didn't fall. She hadn't eaten the fruit yet, so she was still morally perfect. Well, it's because humans were never perfect. She made an error. She made an error before the fall. That's significant. Even prior to eating the fruit, Adam and Eve were fallible. If they weren't, they never would have followed the lines of error that led them to the fall in the first place. They wouldn't have desired the fruit in their heart, another thing that would have been sin later, lust. They would have just continued existing, never having been tempted. Prior to the fall, prior to eating of the fruit that conveyed knowledge of good and evil, there was a void of moral judgment. It was incorrect without being evil. What does that mean, though? It's sort of complicated and not worth going over right now, maybe another video, though it does offer one real grounding truth. It means you can let go of the deep-seated need for perfection, something deep in us, something intrinsic to us, something we seem to hold as a standard that is somehow attainable. I've never heard of Christians or evangelists articulate it, but it is important. I'm not talking about moral perfection, but general perfection. That matters. General perfection was never a part of the plan. Mankind was designed to rely on God. He made us to need Him, but He Himself, by His very nature, is a provider, a perfect provider. It's symbiosis, like perfect symbiosis. Think about it. Given the assumption of a God-created world, when God created the garden, did He not create food for beings that needed to eat? Did He not create rivers of water for beings that needed to drink? Did He not even design lungs and oxygen and mixtures of inert gases so that the creations could breathe? He could have just not done any of that. We have always needed Him, needed the things that He's provided for needs that He created in us. And the thing is, there's no shame in that, despite the shame we seek to manufacture for ourselves in being generally imperfect. We have this absurd notion that we're expected to be flawless in and of ourselves, not merely morally perfect, but godlike in our utter perfection. But this isn't reasonable. Time itself is a mechanism for us to learn and grow. We develop out of infancy, learn to speak, think, and reason, and for some reason we expect to arrive to somehow become perfect at some point. The very foundations of creation oppose this idea. We have needs. Perfect beings don't have needs. Even so, Even amidst the reality that ontologically expects imperfection, well, moral imperfection hurts the most. Why? Because we have the knowledge of good and evil. It comes back to that fruit again. Where we can provide a measure of resources for ourselves despite God having created them, we strive against survival. Where we can edify ourselves amidst other people despite God having created people as our fellowship, we can grow and learn and reason. Yet when we strive against ourselves morally, when we face the reality of our own moral imperfection, in this, we feel pain. God made us to desire this moral perfection. He even expects this. Jesus said, "Therefore, you shall be perfect, as your heavenly Father is perfect." Yet he doesn't expect you to accomplish it alone. He expects people to strive towards it and, in striving, realize it cannot be done without him. This is designed to make us realize that we need God, to seek a relationship with him, to learn to take that which he designed us to need from him who freely gives it. Part 6. Who is God to demand perfection? Who is God to demand perfection? It's a question that gives the Christians the shivers because they're like, well, he's God. He's perfect, because they understand it. Not everyone does. But you don't just magically have the answer to that. It's a hard question. It's also an odd question, though, when you actually think about what you're asking. Because it's also kind of a dumb question. Who is God to demand perfection? Who are we to demand perfection? We do it too, right? We get irritated when others don't see things from our perspective. We believe we're right and others are wrong. We have our own truth, our own seeming perfection, but for some reason God's not allowed to have one too. In reality, who are we to have this expectation and disallow God from doing the same? Well, would a loving God allow X, Y, or Z to happen? It's a fair question. It's a question for another video, unfortunately. It's mostly because it's its own can of worms. Well, a barrel of worms. And worth a full explorative analysis. But a fair question, and one that I promise I will answer, God willing, in another video. This isn't a cop-out either, it's just a recognition that this video can't go on forever, and one topic just will inevitably bleed into another. But let me diffuse the question for a time with another question. Is the apparent evil of the world enough of a reason to dissuade you from exploring the possibility of an answer? Sure, granted, the world looks messed up, and it is, especially with things like natural disasters that seem to kill people indiscriminately for no apparent reason. But consider this. The centerpiece of God's love, the gospel, is his willingness to sacrifice his perfect Son to reconcile and redeem us. God doesn't demand that you sell all your things, go to church every day, or erase your personality. Giving is a product of a generous spirit. Church provides fellowship, which enriches your soul, and your personality was created that way for a reason. May require some tweaking here and there, but he made you the way he made you because he loves you. All he asks initially is the tiniest bit of faith. And all that looks like, at least at the beginning, is a willingness to explore his offer. God, who created everything and set the standard of good, offers a means of healing you at extreme cost to himself. Is that idea not worth entertaining? Sure, you've probably seen imperfect Christians, horrible, evil, apparent Christians even, but is it fair to judge God based on the evils that other people choose to do with their own free will, even if it is in his name? Beyond that, wouldn't you expect people to twist a good thing to their own gain, if they are evil? To lie and deceive? This is rampant in every people group, governments, and even fandoms, let alone religions. On the surface, it feels like yes, you can judge God for not judging evil, but if moral perfection demanded immediate moral perfection and judged all evil as it occurred, wouldn't that also include you and me? Well, no, right? We're good, right? Good enough, we hope. Well, that's the problem. Like we've discussed, we're good-ish. We value good and reject evil, which makes us feel like we're good in the biblical sense, but ultimately we fall short. Why? Not because we mean to, though we often occasionally do choose little evils, sometimes even big little evils. No, it's because our nature, our knowledge of good and evil, is suddenly off. We have a sin nature. There is evil in us. We still value good and hate evil, but we can't perfectly identify either. This is why we're not good. Not perfect good, just good-ish. This is what the stupid question fails to articulate. We want good. We value good. This even extends into wanting and valuing perfection. Yet each and every person, has a moral judgment system that is subtly off one to another. If we all have our own truths, can any of those truths truly be true? Of course not. We claim relative truths can exist in order to comfort ourselves, to lift the burden of pain that comes in facing the actual truth, in facing something our hearts know is false. We are all different. We are all flawed. We cannot have perfection. Only pieces of it we individually value. God, by contrast, is perfect. Pending a deeper dive into why God is perfect, look into Him, not the people representing Him. You will always find failing servants, but the Master demonstrates His perfection consistently. Would you want to be judged based on the actions of your family? Or, for example, if you were a middle school teacher, would you want to be judged based on the morality of your students? What about the worst members of a race or sex? Better yet, have you ever been part of a hobby, interest group, or fandom? How many people want to be judged by the worst among the members of any of those? Extrapolate that into what God has to deal with as it concerns us. Christians don't immediately become perfect. In fact, they never attain perfection in this life. We just try and trend towards it. Some even have a long journey to even become recognizably good. Some aren't even actual Christians, co-opting the faith for personal gain. This is why the Bible says you will know Christians by their fruit, which is to say the outflow of goodness they begin to produce. Some produce more, better fruit in time, and you can track the changes, like a juvenile fruit tree growing better and stronger, with greater harvests over time. But others who claim to be Christians only produce rot. So can we judge the entire species of tree based on products of cherry-picked examples, be they the best or worst? Beyond that, the Bible even talks about how false Christians will co-opt the faith for their own gain. But back to God, and this may be the hardest part, but it becomes a question of whether the reluctance to look further into the matter of whether God cares for you is earnest or just an attempt to protect yourself from taking responsibility. This might be because you don't want to change, but it might just be because you don't want to be let down again. It's not an accusation, really. It's just an observation of human reality, that we're all flawed, that there's many reasons why you might not be interested in God. It don't just come down to the fact that you love twirling your mustache and doing evil. Furthermore, it's an acknowledgement that there's a triad of enemies: the devil and his forces, the collective self-preservation tribalism of the world, and even our own individual moral fallibility. They naturally keep us from looking into God. But God promises to meet people where they are. Take one step towards Him, trust that He might be there, and He'll meet you. Again, God doesn't expect people to be perfect, even if He expects people to strive towards moral perfection. Why? Because He knows it's about what's ultimately best for people, long term. He understands the process. But beyond that, we also know perfection is best for us. It's why we value it. Does it make sense to value perfection then balk at God who wants perfection for us? The problem is we just can't recognize what perfection is, and God wants to fix that. Again, it's because though we value good, the system of valuing is subtly off in a way we can't recognize. Part 7. What is sin? What is sin? This is the ultimate question in this little line of questions. This is what drives the whole topic, the whole video. We think of sin as bad things, little evils God holds against us, but sin is ultimately two things. First, it is our individual evil actions. Evil and good are not binary in the way that we think of it, like a coin flipped between obvious good and obvious evil, but are, in fact, still binary. Sins, which is to say moral failings, are the individual evil acts that free will beings commit, often even thinking these things are good. It's not the difference between 50 and 50, it's a difference between 99.99% and 100%. And that's hard to swallow. Why? Because we want to eke out a 50-50 good and evil equation to survive. But the reality is, even that 0.01%, less than that even, is lethal. It's like some kind of disease or toxin. Just a tiny bit is enough. Second, and more consequentially, sin speaks to the difference of moral opinion between man and God. This is reductive in a way because humans tend to elevate or reduce others to human equality. For example, oftentimes we treat pets like people, but God is not just another person. Good, perfect good, is defined by God for good reason. It's infinite and eternally sustainable. It's the perspective of a God that exists outside of time, understands all the consequences of every action, and defines all the processes that govern who we are and how we think. That is sin nature, having a moral nature that misaligns with God, the one who knows better. I get that it's hard to acknowledge that God knows best because to do so is to relinquish the idea that we know best. But we've already discussed the evidence for our own flaws, even the reality that we were never expected to be functionally perfect. But it is still to admit moral failure, which hurts. Why? It's a surprisingly weird question because we all know it does hurt, can feel the pain of admitting it, but it's often hard to articulate the root of the pain. It hurts because it's all the pieces we have discussed, assembled. We value good and hate evil. We cannot do that perfectly. Finally, we naturally desire perfection. We have to admit that we have failed. We failed in the little sins we commit, but that's only the evidence of a greater problem. We failed to even properly recognize how we fail, substantively. Our moral compass, our very nature, is tainted by sin, by an untrustworthy perspective. But here's the thing. Here's why it hurts and why we're so averse to admitting it. Because the world and the rest of survival has taught us that actions have consequences. If this were a court of law, to admit sin is to admit guilt, to abandon all pretense of a defense, and all hope of getting off of the consequences that come with our culpability in sin, in evil. This is why it hurts. We fear the consequences, be they the immediate little things like looking weak or bad, but also the deeper things, like what being evil says about us and our deepest, darkest understandings of ourselves. No one wants to say, I'm evil. Not you, not me, not even Hitler. That being said, unlike the world ruled by that being Satan, whose name literally means adversary, accuser, and opponent, God does not ask us to confess our evil in order to condemn us. He asks us to confess in order to forgive us, to change us positively. Judgment only comes when we don't confess. We just need to be willing. To seek perfection, one must admit that one is not perfect. People get tripped up in the whole notion of Christianity in the context of God judging people and throwing them into hell. So let's talk about hell. Hollywood describes hell as a literal place where people are thrown, often to be tortured by demons for the rest of eternity. This is inaccurate. Hell is, as described in the Bible, a state of being where God withdraws himself, and the torture, the anguish, forms from a self-imposed realization that the condemned has rejected God. Separation from the source of goodness, separation from God, separation from love, and fully aware of how and why that happened. To better understand hell, imagine you are virtually anywhere, but in the midst of obnoxious, intolerable, perhaps even outright evil people. Is it not reasonable that you should be able to leave? That is the logic of hell, where God leaves people, withdrawing all the good that people refuse to acknowledge comes from him in the process. Why? Simply because they refuse to admit they are flawed and accept the means of changing that. They are left to fend for themselves, which is what they wanted. Independence. Judgment-free existence. But in isolation and with enlightenment, judgment comes from oneself. One sees how evil one truly is, and must live with that. But amidst this, God simply asks that we acknowledge reality, that we face down our own evil, even if we can't quantify it, and trust that he can. He doesn't ask for perfection, only to strive towards it, even slowly. And, finally, even in the midst of asking us to admit our own guilt, he does so having offered up his Son as the propitiation, the cost, in blood, to rectify our evil, even if we don't fully understand that evil or why it is so important. In this, the question of why should I have to change to appease God's wrath dissolves, because he himself paid the price. Is it reasonable to ask why should I have to change when God has sacrificed his Son in order to allow you to do so? When the ultimate consequence of not doing so is God simply exercising his very understandable right to leave you and no longer associate you because you don't want to be like him? God, through Jesus, is willing to forgive all sins, but in the context of going to heaven, do you really think God is unreasonable in being unable to forgive an unwillingness to change? We want to go to heaven. We know heaven requires perfection. We even expect that we will all be made perfect once we get to heaven. Is it such an ask to start the perfection process now? To even simply admit we're imperfect? Or is the heaven we want, the perfection we want, simply for God to change us superficially? Perfect in the body and not of the soul. To be given a place devoid of scarcity, where we can serve ourselves with abundance forever in paradise. But here's the thing. Not even that would fill the void. It would just be a bigger pile, and the void would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and you'd just be facing yourself on an even grander scale. The notion of this sort of heaven, this sort of secular heaven, when properly contextualized, demonstrates just how selfish we truly are. But I don't even say that as an accusation. The world taught you to survive, to protect yourself, to ensure you, the most sacred and secure node of your own existence, continues existing. God asking you to change, to go against your nature, is, in fact, asking you to do the hardest thing for an ego to do. Embrace ego death. Or at least begin to do so, to step out on the edge of self-preservation. But, in asking this, he did what was hardest for him, sacrificing his Son to bear the weight of the consequence. This is, ultimately, an exchange that he models for us, not asking us to do it blindly. We have to sacrifice what is most precious to us, our ego and valuing of self. But he did so first, and demonstrated He is worthy of our trust in doing so. In exchange for the God of the universe sacrificing himself, the most precious thing above and beyond all creation, he asks us to sacrifice our nature, the most sacred thing to a selfish being. It's not equal, of course. Any rational being can see that we get the better half of the deal, but we're emotional beings and fundamentally elevate ourselves above all else. He asks something enormous of us, but he sacrificed something infinite in order to do so and prove we can trust him. He asks us to sacrifice selfishness to our own benefit. Why? Because it's the first step, the requirement for beginning the process of fundamentally changing our nature, of changing our trajectory from self-destruction through our own blinded, flawed morality into a total rebuild that ends in moral perfection. Even in heaven, we can be functionally imperfect, dependent, but we will have unfettered access to God and everything we will ever need. That is heaven, where we're with God again. Even so, to ask us to lay down our will, even if it's fundamentally so simple and reasonable on paper, rational and righteous even, is a monumentally heavy requirement. Yet to do that, to even incline ourselves, to open ourselves to do that, he will meet us where we are and do the heavy lifting. When he asks us to have faith to trust him, he will even give us that faith. The faith needed to have faith. It all comes down to willingness. Because he invested everything in us, he can and does match and exceed everything we offer him in return. Give him a willingness to hear, a true heart-deep openness, and he will seek you. Incline your heart even slightly, and he will maintain that connection, growing it steadily until you choose to pull away. Even in listening to this video, hearing out a flawed man's articulation of a complex, deep, and offensive idea, he will help soften your heart. He is willing, but he doesn't want a devoted slave to a heartless religion, a pious automaton, or a follower of dogmatic rules, even if sometimes Christianity is portrayed that way by the world. He wants the willingness of an open-hearted son or daughter to enter into a relationship. If you want that, it's simple. Admit your own fault. Accept the offer of salvation paid in blood, and it's done. That instant, snap of the fingers. He knows you, down to the bones, down to the soul. If you're earnest and recognize your evil, even unintentional evil, especially unintentional evil, and recognize the price Jesus paid for you to become family, if you believe these things, you are already forgiven. Why? Because he loves you. He sacrificed everything for you, and he wants you to join the family. It's a dysfunctional family, admittedly, at least for a time, at least until heaven, but we ourselves are the dysfunction. He forgives us of all of that. He's perfect, though. That's why we, as Christians, rest on him, and not the people that make up the church. The church will fail you. There are false Christians, wolves in sheep's clothing, who will co-opt the church and use it for their own gain. There are actual Christians, young in the faith, who will carry the baggage of the evil they have not yet given up, or even realize they need to give up, still pursuing evil they think is good. There are even old Christians who will simply make mistakes. But God exists outside of time, knowing and seeing every moment of your life, past, present, and future, with the clarity of the present. He knit you together in your mother's womb. He designed your very soul. You can trust him. You can trust him implicitly. How do we know that? He trusted himself. Jesus, becoming a man, becoming like us, threw off all his power and position to exist under the same burden we do. But he did so perfectly. He did so knowing we would, as a collective species, betray and brutally murder him. And he did this without making a mistake. He did so with perfect moral clarity. He did so as an example, demonstrating personally that even if the entire world is turned against you, as it did against him, that God is faithful and just to ensure that your eternal destiny is one where you are never snatched out of his hand or removed from his protection. He declares you a son or daughter, sins forgiven, treated as if you were as righteous as his own son Jesus. All you have to do is admit you're flawed, take responsibility, and the mercy he offers. He loves you. Let that love manifest into the relationship he wants to have with you. Outro. I've said all I need to say on this topic, at least to introduce it. That said, it leaves a lot of questions, and that's sort of the point of this channel. I want to take these tough questions and answer them. Christianity has a lot of tough questions. What makes God so good? How and why can God require perfection from us? We sort of covered that a little already. Why is the world so messed up? How does he allow murderers, rapists, and evil people to roam the world? Heck, why does God allow natural disasters even? I plan on answering those, and not just vaguely appealing to some greater plan. Logic, reason, and rationale. God may conceal the details of certain specific actions, but he actively encourages sons and daughters to ask concerning his character. All those questions have specific answers. Then there are some hard questions for those who are already Christians. Why did the fall occur? Why not just make us perfect to begin with? How about the old debate? Predestination or free will? What happens to those who never hear the good news? This channel is new, but it's the culmination of something that's been developing for years, if not decades. I feel a compulsion to share answers. Answers to questions I have found myself asking, unsatisfied with the answers given by recorded theology. Having hunted for these truths, I don't want to be selfish and not sharing what I've found. Granted, I'll do so imperfectly, I expect, but I'll do so with a willingness to recognize my own flaws and improve. To that extent, if you would be willing to leave a comment, I want to read your feedback. There's a lot of room for improvement. If you found this video helpful, I'd love to hear that too. Encouragement really helps, especially at the beginning. Also, if you have any questions you would like me to answer, feel free to ask. Nothing is off the table. Well, anything that won't get your comment flagged as a violation of terms anyway. You know the deal. Overall, I just want to hear from you. On that same front, likes and subscriptions are greatly appreciated, because that's how the system works. It is what it is. I plan on doing another couple of videos first, but once I get my feet on solid ground, I plan on doing a more formal what I could use from you / how to help me / growing the channel video. For now, as said, comments, likes, and the normal things are well appreciated. I hope this video was useful to you, and I'll see you next time. Well, you'll see me. You know what I mean. Have a great rest of the day and rest of your life.